Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. I would now like to call on the Deputy Opposition Leader to take the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, very much like the first government member that came up and spoke to you, I'd like to get a cheap populist round of applause to kick off with as well, and I'd like to make sure that mine's the loudest. So, good afternoon, everybody. It's quite possibly because there was a big picture of it sitting right behind him that made me think, Mr. Speaker, that the case set out by the first member on the government was very much like the Parthenon itself. Not necessarily because it stood as a beacon of truth to philosophy, intellectual endeavour and oratory, but more because it was full of holes and wasn't nearly as exciting as I thought it was going to be. And I'd like to look at it on two levels. I'd like to look first of all at the first premises from which they built their argument, and then I'd like to look at the practical concerns which they then expressed through it. So let's look first of all at first premises. And the first one that we had was that there's been a great backlash in the West against moral foreign policy, and that we're somehow in a situation now in the West where we're all queuing up to make cheap political points from a moral foreign policy and not pursuing examples of free trade. Well, it may have escaped the attention of the speakers on that side of the House, but the recent visit of China to the USA, which instituted a wide-ranging program of free trade, is possibly the most salient example of the last year of the way in which Western governments are viewing trade and the freedom of it. No, thank you. A similar example would be the recent signing of a large arms contract by Great Britain to Indonesia. The second point, the second premise that they made, was that when states trade in this way, and when governments do so, they do so entirely in their own interests, and there's no moral element to it at all. And that point was significantly dealt with by the Speaker on this side of the House, who gave you the example of South Africa, which you failed to address in any way whatsoever. And if you'd like to do so now, I'd be glad to hear.
I addressed it totally. I said you could get cheap votes from saying we're anti-racist. Explain why the policy on Cuba is different from the policy on China.
I failed to swallow this bland assertion, which now the proposition have made on 3 occasions, that the only motivating factor for the Western world's stance upon South Africa and the sanctions it imposed on it was cheap political points. That's simply not the case, Madam Speaker. And I'd like to hear some sort of recognition from that side of the House that there was an important element in that, and that the democratically elected governments of those nations were reflecting the will of their people, who said, we don't want free trade with these countries. We don't want to support tacitly or explicitly these regimes by free trade. And that is why those democratically elected governments did so. Now, this seems to be another major premise on that side of the House. And the third one, that you can somehow remove foreign policy and you can somehow remove trade policy from the democratically elected framework of the government itself. Now, what we have said on this side of the House is, what is wrong with a democratically elected government reflecting the will of those people who voted for it in their foreign policy?
Sir.
What is wrong with them saying, no, we accept the concerns of the people that voted for us, and we will choose not to trade with people those people do not support? Sir. Yes, please.
Was the government of the United States democratically elected to affect the people of Cuba? The Cuban people did not vote in that election.
Yeah, but you see, the argument that's been put forward, Madam Speaker, is quite simply one based upon principle. And they have said the salient point that we should seek to support is one of consistency. And it is a fundamental wrong to introduce into the global policies of individual nations anything which displays such inconsistency. And our point is quite simply this. Nations will have differing concerns. They will have differing views on differing nations. Britain, for example, has specific concerns and has demonstrated consistently specific concerns towards human rights abusers in its former colonies, and has adopted a different policy towards them because of the historical background which surrounds it. Now, it's quite simply this point, Mr. Speaker. Why should those democratically elected governments in those individual nations not adopt differing foreign policies to differing nations? And to stand up here and in the name of consistency suggest that that's somehow fundamentally wrong just doesn't have any philosophical basis in truth. Because, Mr. Speaker, that quite simply, we are left with a choice When we have a nation who abuses human rights within its nation or is an aggressor to those outside of doing something or not. Now, there are possibly three options open to us, Mr. Speaker. There is the option of imposing economic pressure and sanctions. There is the option of imposing military sanctions on that nation, or there is the option put forward by the government of selling them stuff in the hope that they won't do it anymore, with presumably the proviso that if you carry on doing it, we'll sell you even more stuff to really make sure that you get the point. There's been absolutely no proof. No, thank you. There's been absolutely no proof either, Mr. Speaker, either on the point that trade does improve the human rights in a nation and that trade does induce governments through its tacit approval of them to treat its people better. And there's been absolutely no proof, which is the second premise on that side of the House, that these benefits somehow trickle down to the people within them. It would be my contention, Mr. Speaker, that if we did have free trade with a country like Iraq, Saddam Hussein would do exactly what he's done with the revenues of such trade in the past and keep the vast majority of it for himself. Would he not, Mr. Heath?
Your first speaker said you should trade on a matter of, you should have sanctions on a matter of principle. You said different countries can have different concerns. Isn't that a contradiction?
No, not at all. We've said the principle that we support is the principle which allows countries to adopt individual foreign policies regarding trade to other nations. That is a principle which is fundamental to the idea of democracy and to the idea of the individual concerns of different nations. Now, some countries will choose to impose sanctions and some won't. We don't have a problem with that. We think that's precisely the sort of principle we should be advocating. But what you failed to do, and you're out of time, is give us any single example to prove these two contentions, Madam Speaker. Firstly, that trade improves human rights, and secondly, that if you do trade, the lot of the people in the country is benefited. We got the example of Iraq, which is the only one we've had so far and can be dealt with very quickly. It's my contention, Mr. Speaker, that the plight of the people in Iraq is not down so much to sanctions as it is down to the Saddam Hussein oppressive regime dissipating the wealth of the country through the Gulf War and the Iran-Iraq conflict and keeping the medicines and other things that are exempted from the sanctions for himself. There is no proof on that side of the House on either of their two central contentions, and so I seek to oppose it.